Hello, and thank you very much for being here today for our presentation. Luisa Bavieri and myself both work at the Language Center at the University of Bologna, and today we're going to be talking about developing interpersonal and intercultural skills in a university language course. Very quickly, we will begin by introducing the concept of intercultural learning in foreign and second language courses. Then we will introduce our research study. We will then discuss the data and the results. And finally, we will present our conclusions on intercultural language learning and teaching. Intercultural language learning and teaching is much advocated in contemporary foreign language classroom contexts. According to this perspective, language proficiency and target culture knowledge are no longer the only learning objectives. Rather, learning objectives include a wider set of abilities and attitudes which can be applied in order to understand a plurality of cultures, including one's own. In such a context, the role of the language teacher is to introduce into the language classroom materials and instruments to combine intercultural and linguistic aims. So how can communicative and intercultural objectives coexist in intercultural foreign language education goals? In the intercultural language classroom, students have to acquire linguistic and discourse structures, vocabulary, and socio-pragmatic elements in order, for example, to express similarities and differences in cultural practices, explain, interpret, and discuss cultural perspectives and practices in texts and in intercultural encounters, exchange information about one's own and others' cultural values and attitudes, express opinions on facts and events, taking into consideration different perspectives. These are seldom found as learning objectives in standard foreign language manuals and courses. Among models of intercultural competence, few specify how intercultural competence is linked to communicative competence in the foreign language at the operational level of teaching methodology. A notable example is Borghetti 2013. Moreover, these models are proposed for any teaching context, regardless of the specific target language, the age of the students, and what we're interested in here, the language level. But as the development of students' communicative competence in the target language still remains a priority in intercultural foreign language education, what are the implications of proposing intercultural activities to students with a very low L2 proficiency level? Several studies illustrate how language learning and intercultural learning don't necessarily follow the same pace. So that, for example, a person can possess a high level of linguistic competence and have at the same time an ethnocentric and essentialist vision of the other. On the other hand, a low level of the target language competence doesn't necessarily mean that students don't possess intercultural awareness in his or her first language, or other L2s in which the speaker is more proficient. In fact, Byram differentiates between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence, where the second implies intercultural competence in a foreign language. Bavieri and Livatino show how in intercultural tasks with groups of students having limited linguistic proficiency, the deficiency of discourse instruments necessary to carry out linguistically complex actions induce students to use languages different from the target language, for example, English as a lingua franca or their L1, so as not to lose the opportunity to communicate their reflections. The intercultural language classroom then becomes a space in which students can resort to their entire linguistic repertoire in order to communicate. This openness to what has been theoretically defined as translanguaging contrasts with the all too common attitude of monolingualism in the language classroom. The first step to introduce intercultural objectives into the L2 language classroom is to identify intercultural communicative activities where the L2 development results from a critical reflection on self and other, from the exposure to diverse perspectives, from the mediation between views. The objective then extends to the development of the abilities to communicate appropriately in intercultural encounters. These activities can be proposed in the language class, considering a plurilingual communicative environment and at the same time adapting them to the competence level of the students. A very practical tool, very much used by language teachers to develop the language syllabus, has been since 2001 the Common European Framework of Reference. But the notion of intercultural competence, referred to briefly in sections 5113 and 5122, was not greatly developed in the 2001 version, and no validated and calibrated descriptors attaining to interculturality were included. The new edition of the Common European Framework contains additional descriptors and was published in 2018. Following extensive consultation undertaken in 2016 and 17, this latest edition integrates domains relevant to language education across the curriculum, such as intercultural competence. Mediation is introduced as a key concept of communicative language competencies. Descriptor scales are provided for mediating a text, mediating concepts, mediating communication, and for plurilingual and pluricultural competencies in order to build the learner's intercultural competence. The role of language learning in developing intercultural understanding through plurilingual communicative competence is emphasized in this latest version. Following the notion of Crams's third space from 1993, here the notion of pluricultural space is introduced and defined as a shared space between and among linguistically and culturally different interlocutors, i.e. the capacity of dealing with otherness, to identify similarities and differences, to build on known and unknown cultural features in order to enable communication and collaboration. A study describing the integration of CEF descriptors with intercultural learning objectives in a B1 level L2 language course illustrates how, in general, CEF descriptors can represent a contribution to raising teachers' and students' awareness of the addressed intercultural concepts. But what happens if intercultural activities are proposed in an A1, A2 course? Which level of intercultural reflection can be expressed and reached when language competence is at a basic or elementary level? In this study, the teacher investigated the use of an intercultural activity and its outcomes in an Italian L2 low elementary course at the Language Center of Bologna University, attended by exchange, by degree seeking and asylum seeking students. The research was designed to explore how the students engaged with the activity, their level of commitment, and the degree to which they considered the intercultural tasks to have had an influence on their behaviors. Students' comments were collected after the completion of the task through audio recorded semi-structured individual interviews. The activity done during the course was a 24-hour Erasmus Life. This is part of the open intercultural learning resources produced as an outcome of the European project IREST, Intercultural Education Resources for Erasmus Students and Their Teachers. The IREST activities were not designed as language teaching activities, but they can and have been adapted to the L2 classroom. Students' writing of their personal journals is the leitmotif of the activity. Students are invited to reflect on the intercultural experience they are living abroad, namely around 4 themes. The emotional dimension of living abroad, linked to the concept of culture shock. Students' social contacts in the light of their felt or imposed needs, for example, the need to have local friends. The academic life in the host institution, and finally, the language experiences, including identity-related aspects of language proficiency. The students were then asked to write a text at home related to one of these weekly topics. Then they sent the text to their teacher, who read it and corrected it. And from all these texts, the teacher selected some passages and collected them anonymously in a document used for group and classroom discussion. The objective was to help students reflect on their experience, interact with other students and their teacher, compare and possibly review their point of view, and acquire awareness of intercultural practices linked to the study abroad experience. In order to address the students' limited language competence, the activity was simplified both quantitatively and qualitatively. The CEF states that at A2, that is low elementary level, students can convey relevant information contained in clearly structured, short, simple informational texts, provided that the texts concern concrete, familiar subjects and are formulated in simple, everyday language. The task was therefore reduced to a maximum of 100 words. And for the oral discussion, the students received factual questions, a lot of written support, and pre-prepared basic texts ready for use. Here is an example of the kinds of extracts given to the students. These have been translated into English as they were written in Italian by the students themselves, and also an example of the questions that were provided for group discussion, and these were also written in Italian. I will just leave you now 1 minute to read the extracts, the 2 extracts out of a total of 7 extracts, and the questions.
So after this example of the written task, let's go back to our research. As Anna explained, the research questions we identified in this study were: how did students engage with the activity? What kind of commitment did they put on the task? And to what degree did they consider the intercultural task to have had an influence on their behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs about themselves and others? Students' comments were collected through audio recorded semi-structured individual interviews of salient transcribed parts, supported by a thematic analysis of the written reflection. The interviewees we examined were 3 PhD students, 1 female and 2 males, aged from 24 to 26. They come from Spain, India, and China. They have been in Italy for 3 months to 1 year, And before this language course, Pedro from Spain had never studied Italian. Nalim from India studied it by himself and informally with Italian friends. And May studied Italian in China for about 1 year. English and Spanish were the languages for the interviews. The interviews was composed by 3 questions. The first 2 questions refers to the research question about how the students engaged with the activities and their level of commitment. We asked them, can you describe the proposed activities? Did you like them? What did you like most and what did you like less? While the third questions refer to the research question about the degree to which they consider the activity to have had an influence on their behaviors and attitude. And we ask them, can you tell an episode, an anecdote, a particular experience about the completion of the tasks? And these are the results. The themes that emerged are, in terms of comprehension, the 3 students gave a detailed description of the activities and they understood clearly what they had to do. The objectives of the activity were less clear and which were understood only at the end by Pedro, partially understood by Nellin, or understood as the teacher's hidden agenda, or simply not mentioned at all due to the overwhelming language difficulties to intercept even the basic meaning of the instruction on the part of May. Another theme was appreciation. This went from a general and convinced appreciation by Pedro to a partial appreciation by Nalin, just the written task, and to a lack of judgment due to the big language difficulties as specified by May. The 3 students anyway agreed positively on the high degree of interactivity of the task and the support they gave to acquire awareness about the common conditions of living abroad, as in the words of May, happy to see that everybody has the same relational linguistic problems as I have. In terms of commitment, students felt that they were impelled to complete the task, even if all of them stressed the language difficulties. During the group discussion, they referred that everybody used English when their Italian was too poor to express themselves, and that anyway they preferred code switching or code mixing to remaining silent. Pedro pointed out that the lesser the language difficulties, the more the activity was enjoyable and successful. And when language problems are consistent, as in the case of Nalin and May, the comments are just on language use and not specifically on the intercultural activity itself, and with different outcomes. In Nalin's case, the effort has paid off, resulting in a progress in the target language competence, while in May's case, it produces instead an excessive overload and a sense of fatigue towards learning. What about the impact? The intercultural activities impacted on the process of self-reflexivity. They seem to have an influence on Pedro's behavior, the one with fewer language problems. Pedro refers to positive effect of the Erasmus experience on his shyness, on his ability to interact with other people, which the activities contributed to reinforce. This analysis the analysis of self-knowledge, of self-awareness in relation to the other is a first fundamental step in the intercultural competence development. In the other two cases, even if occasional intercultural reflection on the benefits of the class encounter are present, the activities impacted more on the reflection on language learning, in the case on Nalin, and on the development of abilities to overcome language barriers through relational strategies. May refers then when she couldn't intervene in group discussions, she couldn't give her contribution, she wrote to the other students inviting them to play switch with her during and after the course so that they could share game stories. So we can say that they had an impact on attitudes and beliefs about themselves and others in relation to language use and identity. So what are our conclusions about intercultural learning in a low-level L2 language course? If intercultural learning implies cognitive, affective, and behavioral change, then here we have an example by Pedro. Writing the journal helped me to gain confidence and self-esteem. And if intercultural learning implies development, attitudes, knowledge, and abilities development not associated to specific cultural group, and this development occurs when experiencing cultural diversity, but when the experience is accompanied by forms of critical reflection, we have two examples by May and Nalin. May tells us that activities were an opportunity of knowledge and sharing feelings. Happy to see that everyone is doing so hard. I can say, oh, I'm not the only one. And Nalin tells that very diverse class, very different directions, but you can understand you are not alone in the difficulties. And last but not least, what are our conclusions about intercultural language learning? We can say, first of all, that the proposed activities help students go beyond cultural comparison and turn inward and reflect critically on themselves. Data show an impact on self-reflexivity. Another important thing is that the materials that students used to practice the L2 abilities, vocabulary and grammar structure, were, besides the exercises found in manuals, the self-produced journal, their discussion, their own presentation. And when the L2 couldn't be used before the low competence, students switched to English as a lingua franca or any other language that could be of some use to communicate. Students' multilingual repertoires helped the group move forward in the discussion, experience diversity in the very act of discussing it, and regarding the language learning, progressing with the L2. As in the word of Nalin, when I succeeded to explain something to a student, that thing remained in my head more than when I studied it. So this is the conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye. Bye.